why is there such a high correlation between Bitcoiners and health? Why is there such a high correlation between Bitcoiners and people that are kind of industrious, whether that means they're an entrepreneur or they're somebody that works hard? Why are they such industrious people? I think it's because we're seeing that the way the world works, the old paradigm, isn't the way we want the world to be, and there's a new and better way to do things. And the parallel system is one of decentralization.
Today, I'm excited to welcome Brian Dimon to the podcast. Brian is the best-selling author of Parallel and head of marketing for the Orange Pill app. He's also the CEO of Salt and Light Wellness Centers. Welcome to the Bitcoin Edge, Brian.
Thanks for having me, Paula. I know we've been trying to set this up for a while, so I'm glad that you were able to. You were so generous and so flexible. So thanks for working around my schedule and making this happen.
Well, thanks so much for joining me. I have been looking forward to talking to you. But before we get to Bitcoin, tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're living, your background, what you studied.
Oh my goodness. I grew up in Southern California, and I've lived in the same city my entire life except for 1 year. I lived in San Diego for a year, but outside of that, I grew up been in the same town. I love it. California, people have mixed feelings about California. It's, we call it California. There's all sorts of political turmoil going on here, just like there is, I guess everywhere in the world. But to me, that's being in the grit, in the fight it's a good place to be. I think that's, if you could be in the most peaceful place in the world, but if you're on Twitter, if you're online and you're kind of in the Bitcoin space, you're used to that tension and that turmoil anyways, of pushing forward what you believe are good and prudent ideas. And so I like living in that space. I like living in as a generally kind of small government individual. I like living in I know it sounds weird. I like living in a big government type of state, not because I like the politics, but because I like that tension. I think that I feel like I'm somebody that's called to a purpose. And I believe everybody's called to a purpose. I do think that those who are willing to put forward good and strong ideas, they should get comfortable with being in uncomfortable situations. And that's one of the most encouraging things about what I get to do with Orange Pill. We can get into that, but I get to be around Bitcoiners all the time. And so the amount of accountability you get to have, the amount of encouragement, I'm very plugged in with my church as well. And so I get to have a really strong social connection pretty much in most elements of my life. And so that part of my life is where I live and who I get to interact with is very rewarding. There's tension, there's encouragement, there's everything on that spectrum. But I think that makes my life feel pretty rich and enjoyable. As far as what things that I study, I love to study. First of all, was Bitcoin, of course, and studying money. I think it's turned into my most recent books I'm reading are things on just like value in general, more business economics and behavioral psychology. That was actually my background in college, which I'm kind of coming back around to, but behavioral psychology and the interplay with how that affects people and how they spend their money and use their money. That applies, in my business, but that also applies in some of the ideas I push for in my latest book, Parallel, and just understanding how a parallel economy is emerging and is going to emerge and ultimately win in the end. I find why people do what they do to be a phenomenally fascinating field of study. Why did I wake up and decide that we were going to, talk across the world today? Why did you decide that same thing? There's so many different things going on in any calculation or in any thing that happens in our life. There's so many variables to get us to this point. And so how do we integrate the study of history? How do we integrate the study of human psychology as we know it now to make the best predictions about the future? That's what everybody's trying to do. Everybody's trying to predict the future. And those who can do it with the highest degree of accuracy tend to be the ones that benefit the most. And it sounds woo-woo and it sounds kind of like you're full of yourself or self-righteous to say that we can predict the future. We're not saying it in like a crystal ball type of way, But that's what every investor is trying to do, is trying to understand where things are going in the future. And so we as Bitcoiners, and we as people that are trying to push forward better ideas of parallel systems and things like that, it's critically important that we understand where things are headed. You don't want to be on the wrong train at this point in history. And I think that we as Bitcoiners are certainly on the right train.
Well, and do you think that the more you study and the more you learn, the more you are better at predicting the future, because it almost seems inevitable?
It does, and I think that yeah, that can come off, again, like I said, self-righteous or arrogant when we say that, but it's not like I don't think anyone Bitcoiner is we don't claim to be the one person that has that predictive ability. I think we kind of universally are saying we're seeing the same things, and I think that it involves a bit of humility, actually, is to say, am I seeing all the angles? And that's why why do people watch Bitcoin podcasts or listen to Bitcoin talks or talks on economics? Or why do we go back and we listen to or read von Mises? Why do we do this? It's because we're constantly looking for, are we seeing all the angles? And those who are asking if they're seeing all the angles tend to be the ones that just do the best. And you go back and you look at somebody like a professional poker player. What's the difference between a professional poker player and an amateur poker player, somebody that's just doing it for fun? A professional poker player, they don't win 100% of the time. They win drastically more than anybody else, though, because they are trying to constantly assess, looking at all of the angles. How many cards are on the table? How many people are in the hand? How much is this guy betting, or does he normally bet like this? So there's constantly all these variables that he's trying to see, and is he checking all the variables to make sure that this makes sense? The person who can constantly ask themselves that, it's those people throughout history seem to be the ones that are right more often than not. So when somebody asks me, hey, where do I think the prices of Bitcoin is going? And I say, I think Bitcoin's, it's to me, it's a foregone conclusion that it's going to go well over $1 million. That sounds dumb and perhaps arrogant to somebody who's outside of Bitcoin. But to me, if you see the history of fiat currencies and you see the kind of the point of history we're in, to me, it does seem like a foregone conclusion. And I constantly am checking that against what are other people that have a high degree of study in this field saying, and there seems to be a lot of agreement. Now, that doesn't mean consensus makes it right. I think it edges you towards a higher percentage of being right. So is it 100% certainty that Bitcoin's going to be over $1 million someday? No. And in my mind, it seems like a high degree of certainty, but I have to be humble enough to understand that there might be variables I'm not seeing. And because I understand that I don't know all of the factors at play, I'm constantly reassessing and trying to study those factors. That's why this integration between study and the social layer of connecting with other Bitcoiners is so important, to constantly refine our perspective. I will say, though, that as my perspective is refined, I'm only becoming more and more bullish on Bitcoin, and I think that that's because of we have a pretty good level of evidence on our side that Bitcoin's going to pretty thoroughly win in the money game.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. I speak to so many people, and it just seems to make people better Bitcoin. But we'll get into that. You mentioned the poker players. I am an ex-tennis player, and I heard Roger Federer speak. I think it was at the Princeton graduation, and he said he won 54% of his points, and he's one of the best tennis players in the world, right? And often he only won one more point than the other player total, but he obviously won the right points. A little side note. I want to hear
Well,
about your.
I
Go
real
ahead.
quick, I've seen that speech as well, and
Yeah.
it's incredibly impactful. If anybody hasn't seen Roger Federer's I think it was Princeton. What do you call that? Not a keynote speech, but it's I forget what they call that. A graduation speech. It wasn't when he was graduating, but he was coming back, and he talks about the reason why he was able to do that was the difference between successful tennis players and the unsuccessful ones are the ability to not carry over the last point into this point, right? So you evaluate the last point, but you're never demoralized from the last point, because it's different. So, I love the sport of MMA, but in the sport of MMA, you could have one guy that comes out and just knocks the other guy out. The other guy literally doesn't score against him at all. And so that could be very mentally discouraging. And the champion in MMA might be somebody that's just blown through everybody and nobody's ever scored on him. But in a sport like tennis, the greatest players have to learn how to get scored on. There is offense that is done against them, and that in those types of sports is what makes them great. So this assessment of the last point matters so that I have better information, but it doesn't matter because I know it doesn't predict the next point. And momentum in something like tennis, I'm not a proficient tennis player, but I understand that momentum in a sport like tennis is very impactful.
And also let go of the last point. Don't beat yourself up. So we could talk about Bitcoiners who sold at the wrong time. Keep going. You're in the right place. But I'd like to hear a little bit about your Bitcoin journey. How did you find Bitcoin, and tell us about that?
The first time I ever heard about Bitcoin was I never watched college football. There was a Saturday morning. I think this was in like 2012 or 2013. I'm sure somebody could look it up. But I happened to be just flipping through the channels, and it was college Saturday football was on that morning. And right before one of the games, they have the announcers on the sidelines, and they're, they have their microphones and they're breaking down what they think is going to happen in the game. And they have all the college students in the background right behind them. And one of the college students was holding up a sign that said, "Hey mom, send Bitcoin." And it had a QR code on it. And I was like, what? Bitcoin? What? Yeah, what's that? That's okay. That's weird and interesting. And so I didn't think anything about it for a few days. And then partway through the next week, I remember thinking, oh, what was that Bitcoin thing? I meant to look it up. So I Googled it, and I found that on, I don't know if it was Bitcoin Talk or it was just like a Reddit forum at the time, but all the Bitcoiners were going crazy. They were saying, guess what? Bitcoin is on ESPN. We've never had this much publicity before. And it was just so funny because that's how small Bitcoin was, that Bitcoin wasn't being featured on ESPN. It was just in the background. Nobody was even talking about it. It was just in the background of a shot. And so Bitcoiners was just all the rage. Apparently this guy had something like $20,000 worth of Bitcoin sent to him. People just scanning the QR code on their TV and just thinking it would be fun to send this college kid some money. And it was just a bunch of like people sending, $20 of Bitcoin, $50 of Bitcoin. I'm sure some whale probably sent more, but that was in 2012 or 2013. $20,000 worth of Bitcoin. Imagine if that kid held on to it. Again, he probably didn't. I mean, if I'm a college kid and I get $20,000 worth of Bitcoin and I don't fully know what it is, I'm probably going to be selling it. So anyways, that was the first time I heard about it, but that just kind of proved to me that this is weird and wonky and it's magic internet money. I had some friends that had bought some, and I kind of got frustrated by them buying it because I remember thinking that, hey, this is the thing that was on that college kid's sign, and so it's obviously a joke. So I started studying Bitcoin in 2013, I know, is when I started studying it. And I was studying it from a skeptical perspective to try and get my friends to stop buying it. And so I, started studying what is money. And I started, studying first time I ever became familiar with what fiat currency is. And, I wanted to tell them about how Bitcoin's a Ponzi scheme and it's tulip mania. So through the study of those things, it became abundantly clear that not only is Bitcoin not those things, like it's not tulip mania, it's actually the solution for tulip mania. For anybody in the audience, I know you know what it is, but for anybody in the audience who isn't familiar with it, tulip mania was the Dutch tulip mania, was this phenomenon that happened in the 1600s, where tulips were they were such a rare flower in one of the harvest seasons and it was new. Wealthy people were paying basically the equivalent of like a mansion for one tulip. The prices were insane. People were paying years' salaries to get one of these tulips. And everybody the next growing season had the same idea. They said, oh my gosh, everybody was making a killing on tulips last year, so I'm going to harvest as many tulips as I can. The next year, there was a drastic increase in supply. Everybody was growing tulips and they tried to sell them. Well, that influx of supply crashed the price of tulips. And so tulip mania was known as this thing where people basically got the rug pulled out from under them because of a shift in the market. And that's what kind of low information people say about Bitcoin. But when you understand the economics of what went on in tulip mania, you understand that our sovereign currencies are tulips. Our sovereign currency, because what is the fundamental problem with tulip mania? The fundamental problem was infinite supply of something that was supposed to be an economic good or a monetary good. And that's exactly what's happening with fiat currencies. Bitcoin is actually the solution to that. At the time, the fix for tulip mania would have been gold as the most sound form of money. In our day and age, that most sound form of money would be Bitcoin because it's scarce, it's actually finite. So through the study of that, it became abundantly clear to me that, wow, there's something of interest here. And now, like anybody else, I eventually went through my crypto phase and started playing around with altcoins because there was a huge temptation in 2016 to do that. But I even worked on a blockchain project for a few years. I could tell you all sorts of crazy stories, but inevitably, because of that experience, I came back to a Bitcoin only position in about 2019. And have been really trying to advocate for Bitcoin as a sound form of money and why it's beneficial for our future. So in 2022, I got to get on the team with Orange Pill app. So I'm a partner in Orange Pill app now. I get to work with people like BTC Sessions and Natalie Brunell and Knut Svanholm and Daniel Prince, Nico from Simply Bitcoin. These guys that I've watched their content for years, I now get to be coworkers with them. And it's great to be able to partner with people like that in pushing forward connecting Bitcoiners. I mean, I don't think there's a much bigger cause in Bitcoin. Probably the two biggest things that Bitcoiners could do, or maybe probably the three biggest things I would say, is buying Bitcoin and holding it, connecting with other Bitcoiners, and then spending your Bitcoin. I think that those three elements are necessary for a parallel system. Now, one of the biggest pieces, or the most pushback I ever get in the Bitcoin space, is when I ask people to spend their Bitcoin. So some of your viewers might say, I'm going to turn off right now because he said to spend my Bitcoin. But we could flesh that out. But that's kind of to go from where I came from and seeing Bitcoin on a sign on ESPN to now being somebody that's a massive advocate, not only for getting some Bitcoin, but actually using it as a form of money. I think my turnaround has been pretty drastic. And so it's been a very fun ride.
Yeah, that's a great story. And I definitely want to talk about that because one of my first guests was Jeff Booth, and he believes that in order for Bitcoin to survive, it must become a medium of exchange. And I happen to agree the more I study. So we'll get to that. But tell us about the Orange Pill app. How does it benefit users?
So the cool thing about Orange Pill app is that we're not a social media app. We're a social networking app, and there's a distinct difference there. Social media would be Facebook, Twitter, X, whatever type of thing that people are used to, as far as you log in and you scroll, you see what people post, you see what pictures they put out. That's social media. It's a form of content exchange. With a social network, you are just focused on making social connections with other people. So there's not a feed in Orange Pill app. Well, there is, but the feed isn't content. The feed is other users. So when you open the app, you're going to find users, other members. I'm sorry, they're not users. They're members of the app who are geographically closest to you. It uses approximate geolocation. So if you were sitting in the same room as me and I opened up the app, it would say we were 5 to 10 miles away. So it doesn't know exactly where we're at for security purposes. But what it does do is it enables me and you to message one another if we aren't in the same room and say, hey, we're close enough. Let's go grab some coffee today, or let's go grab some lunch, and we can talk about Bitcoin, or we can talk about whatever. But you can connect with Bitcoiners who are in your neighborhood or in your city or in your area, and we see that as a fundamental building block of Bitcoin. One of the other things I say that can sometimes set off Bitcoiners is basically this: is Bitcoin without Bitcoiners is just a bunch of zeros and ones. And I think because we become so dogmatic about Bitcoin that can feel uncomfortable. But think about it. You could have Satoshi's stash. You could have 1,000,000 Bitcoin, but if you have nowhere to spend it and nowhere to redeem it, it's literally worth nothing. And so, imagine someday the exchanges get shut off and you didn't spend any time building connections with other Bitcoiners, and there's no Bitcoin economy, so you can't go to websites and use Bitcoin. The only way you could use it is to find other Bitcoiners. If you don't have any way to exchange it, it has become, even though you hold Bitcoin, this is like a sacred cow I'm slaughtering here, but even though you're holding Bitcoin, it's not going to do you any good. It might on paper look like you have $1 billion or $1 trillion, but your ability to use that as money has gone away. It's not even a savings technology for you anymore. So a savings technology is only as good as your ability to redeem it at some point. Now, maybe you never want to redeem it, and that's your sovereign right. Go for it. But the ability to redeem it is fundamental in your money having value. And so to me, that's why I participated. We have team members who participate in Orange Pill app just because it's fun. Like, it is fun to connect with other Bitcoiners. I went to a meetup on Friday in LA, and you just hang out with Bitcoiners, and we just talked all day. You just spent all day talking to Bitcoiners. You start out on friendship second base when you meet with a Bitcoiner, because you have all this kind of shared history. You know the questions to ask, right? What's your Bitcoin journey? What were your biggest ups and downs? What altcoins did you lose? If you've been in the market for long enough, what altcoins did you lose money on? And what exchange did you have funds on that got rug pulled before you learned to self custody and all that kind of stuff? So we have all this shared story and this these similar ideas. I have Bitcoin friends who are kind of liberal. I have some that are conservative. I have some that are super conservative, all over the place, that are religious, not religious, whatever it happens to be. But you have these kind of shared common threads with people. And so it enables your friend group to expand. So there's a lot of people on Orange Pill app that's just because those are the best kinds of friends to make. And then there's people like me who think that this is a fundamental building block of our economic future. And I do get to have fun along the way. So I think the best systems are ones that are built not just on the mission, but by building something fun and useful along the way.
Well, that's a really good point. Earlier this week, I had somebody on, Kyle Sylvester, and he mentioned that he was on the Orange Pill app
Yeah.
and how much it had helped him, because for most of us Bitcoiners, well, I speak for myself and quite a few, don't have that many other people who want to talk about Bitcoin. So I could really see how that could help, having a little outlet. And
Yeah.
like you say, what you're saying is, if things did shut down, are you saying that we would go peer-to-peer exchange?
Yeah, I mean, it's an insurance option, right? To me, it's probably inevitable that CBDCs are going to roll out at some point. It just that's the way things are going to go. I think CBDCs are actually going to be the best marketing tool ever for Bitcoin. The value proposition of Bitcoin will never have been higher. So I'm not afraid of when CBDCs come out. I pity the people that are going to be late adopters of Bitcoin, because they're going to go through probably some turmoil because of that. But if there is a future where CBDCs become this massive encroachment to society, and the governments were to say that, oh my gosh, Bitcoin is outlawed and the exchanges are shut down, I think we're beyond that. I think we're past escape velocity for that. But let's say in the most dystopian future that were to be the case, then yes, your insurance option, your insurance policy is peer-to-peer Bitcoin. Now, why are CBDC? I actually don't think when CBDCs roll out, they're actually going to be that bad. They're going to be worse than the form of money we have now. You're going to have less privacy if you're using CBDCs than you have right now, because at least you have the option of cash right now. And there's this kind of these intermediaries of banks and credit card providers and stuff. So there's more hoops for bureaucrats and the IRS to have to jump through in order to flag you down and stuff. But CBDCs will be worse than what we have now, but CBDCs I don't think will be as bad as most people think they will be, only because of the current existence of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the ultimate check on the power of what CBDCs would have been. Central bank digital currencies would have been the most powerful tool of tyranny in human history, more powerful than the sword, more powerful than any weapon. CBDCs would have been the most powerful tool of tyranny. God bless it that Bitcoin already exists. CBDCs will not be able to be so egregious because governments know. I mean, look at China. Why did China have to ban Bitcoin? I think officially 4 times, but I think it's unofficially something like 12 times. Why did the most tyrannical government in the most capable tyrannical government in human history, right? Like there's been big tyrants in the past, but technologically technological tyranny, nobody's been more sophisticated than China. They've had to ban it so many times. Well, why did you have to ban something 12 times? It's because the first 11 bans didn't work, right? That's the only reason why you continue to ban something. And so governments know that no matter how much they want to ban Bitcoin, they're incapable of doing it in a full and robust way. And so when they implement CBDCs, they're going to have to throttle it back a bit. And if they go too much, then they're going to push their users over to Bitcoin, and they're going to make the Bitcoin parallel economy flourish. So if we want the parallel economy to flourish, we should wish for CBDCs to be really bad and egregious. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess however you look at it, I don't think they're going to be as bad as we think they are because of that reason.
Well, that's good to hear. So let's go to your book. Tell us, what are the parallels between Bitcoin and the social layer?
So the parallel that we're really talking about in parallel is the parallel economy, right? So it's the difference between kind of the old economic paradigm and the new. It's why do you think? I mean, we talked off air a little bit about our backgrounds in health and wellness, and why is there such a high correlation between Bitcoiners and health? Why is there such a high correlation between Bitcoiners and people that are kind of industrious? Whether that means they're an entrepreneur or they're somebody that works hard and just does extracurriculars, like they work a 9 to 5, but they also are doing a Bitcoin podcast, or they wrote a book, or they have a blog. Why are they such industrious people? I think it's because we're seeing that the way the world works, the old paradigm, isn't the way we want the world to be, and there's a new and better way to do things, and it's small and it's been germinating for a while, but it's a much healthier way. That there's the old system is one that's predicated on keeping people weak, keeping people dependent, because that's how you maintain centralized authority, and the parallel system is one of decentralization, and you can only have decentralization, and you can only have it last for forever. You can only have it kind of continue in perpetuity if those who are in that system are self-sovereign, if they can take care of themselves. That means they're healthy, they're resilient, they're capable, and in the event that something bad does happen, they're economically resourceful. And if something so bad happens that they don't have the resources in order to take care of themselves, they're deeply enough connected into a community where that community will then take care of them. This is where I think collectivists get confused. They're like, well, for example, why are Bitcoiners such a tight knit community? Why will they take care of themselves? Why will churches get together and if one of the church members gets in trouble and they can't pay for their medical bills, the church will then help them? Isn't that communism? No, that's a community. That's far different than a centralized authority taking care of you so that you need to then be dependent on them. I contributed to my church, and I've done so for 20 years. I haven't really gotten a lot of like financial resources from my church. I get to go and use, get to worship with my congregation and that sort of thing, but I've never drawn on those resources. But if I ever fell on hard enough times, my church would probably turn around and help take care of me. And that's how a community works. And that's the same thing with Bitcoin. We're seeing that in the Bitcoin community. I mean, it's kind of one and the same thing, whether people are religious or not. These kind of same things are happening. And so there's a decentralized future and there's a centralized future. And so Bitcoiners we tend to be advocates of that decentralized future. And most of us first understood the merits of decentralization because of Bitcoin. We understood that decentralized money was much better than centralized money. I don't know if you've had the chance to watch the new Tuttle Twins episode. Have you seen the episode on Bitcoin?
No.
If you have a chance, go watch. I think it's just on Twitter. I think you can watch it, but go to Tuttle Twins, at Tuttle Twins. It's a cartoon about Bitcoin, and they have this song. It's actually pretty catchy. It says, where money is controlled, money is corrupted. And my kids sing this song throughout the house. And we see that. And so Bitcoiners first woke up to high degrees of corruption and understanding the way that the world was corrupted because of centralization. It's when you have centralization, you will have corruption. When you have decentralization, it doesn't mean the world is perfect, but those with authority, there's nobody that has authority to exert their bad nature over you, right? You're kind of there to fend for yourself, and hopefully you have enough of a community around you that when something bad happens, you have maybe a little bit more help because of that community. So yeah, that's why I'm a big advocate for it. And obviously, it's a book that goes beyond just a 1 hour podcast. We take a very deep dive on some of these topics. And one of the things that I will say about I think what was the spark of why I wrote Parallel was through the study of parallel systems in the past, because there's been lots of parallel economies in the past, but why are there no parallel? Why have none of those parallel economies existed until today, right? They start and then they die. They start and then they die. Parallel systems always emerge in the collapse of empire. So if you go back to the Roman Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, like the Byzantine Empire, or earlier the Persian Empire, or later the Soviet Union, there's always, when there's a collapse of empire or a collapse of the world order, in response, when the centralized power collapses, people form a parallel system. It's very decentralized, but unfortunately, it's very disorganized, because decentralization usually means it's disorganized. That's the benefit of centralization. It's very organized. And so when the empire collapses for 5 to 15 years, there's typically a parallel system. Out of necessity, it springs up. And so in that parallel system, they might use coins, they might use gold, they might use silver, they might use rocks, they might use shells, whatever it happens to be. This money springs up, and whether it's barter too sometimes, but this parallel system always emerges. But after about 15 years at the longest, sometimes it's much shorter than that, when the new centralized state rises up. So after the Soviet Union collapses, the state's weak for a while, but then Russia rises back up, and then they reabsorb the parallel system back into the state system. And that always happens because that decentralized system is so disorganized. And it's always a response to the collapse of empire. What makes Bitcoin unique, it's the only time in human history that the parallel system is actually being developed in advance of the collapse of empire, in advance of the collapse of the new world order. I guess it would be the new world order, not capital N new world order. And so it's developing ahead of time. And so if the empire were to collapse, the world order were to collapse tomorrow, Bitcoin would have the biggest head start a parallel systems ever had. It's probably not going to collapse tomorrow. It's probably going to take some time. So Bitcoin might have 15, 20, 25 years of a head start of developing. And why that matters is because Bitcoin is decentralized like those other parallel systems, but because it has such a head start, it's the most decentralized, organized, other than, because decentralization is usually disorganization. It's decentralized, but it's had a chance to germinate. So it has the highest degree of organization as a parallel system that human history has ever seen. So this is humanity's first and perhaps only attempt at a parallel system that will have staying power. And so I think we're at a very unique time in human history. I think when people hear that, it tends to get the wheels turning of like, wow, how important this is that I participate in this parallel economy. Now, you don't have to go out and spend every sat you have in order to do that. I think buying and holding Bitcoin is a perfectly respectable way to participate in that. But I do think it is important that Bitcoiners in particular, start to make as many connections with other Bitcoiners. Online is important, but going back to Orange Pill app, in real life, in-person connections are critically important for the next phase of Bitcoin's epoch.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you see this parallel system being the only system one day?
I think there's a good chance that the parallel system will be the main system. It'll be the system of choice. But I believe that sovereign nations will always want their fiat currencies. And maybe there will be a symbiotic relationship at some point that exists between fiat currencies and Bitcoin. Maybe the most robust economies will have their own fiat currency, but then they'll try to tether it to Bitcoin somehow. That's possible. We'll see. I mean, El Salvador is kind of starting on a microscopic level, and we'll see how just a straight up Bitcoin treasury does for a small country. I think it's difficult to think that every country will go over to this. But this will be like anything else. There will be countries that have a Bitcoin standard. There will be countries that have a quasi Bitcoin standard, and there will be countries that don't at all. And that's similar to what we see right now in terms of political orders, right? There are republics. There are countries with constitutions that protect people's rights. And then there are countries that if you live in them, there's no protection for your individual rights. Now, people can either voluntarily, like pretty easily move from those jurisdictions, or sometimes they have to take their family in the middle of the night and move from those jurisdictions. But nonetheless, if people want certain freedoms and protections, they will move to a different country. And I think that will be part of the allure of countries of the future. Is your country plugged into the Bitcoin economy? I think that will be a reason for people to move to your country. And so countries will compete. That will be a selling point. I think El Salvador, Bhutan now, Argentina perhaps at some point, or not Argentina, Venezuela, or yeah, forget where's Malay. He's Argentinian. I always mix Venezuela and Argentina. So, anyways, those countries right now are setting the groundwork for that competitive nature that's going to take place amongst countries. I was just, like I said, at a Bitcoin meetup last Friday. I talked to several gentlemen who are Americans. They live in California. They live in, perhaps the wealthiest state in the wealthiest country in the world. And they're strongly considering moving to El Salvador. Why would you move to a country that 3 years ago was one of the most gang infested countries in the world? Well, because they've adopted a Bitcoin standard, and Bitcoin entrepreneurs are celebrated and kind of put, they're given certain advantages there. So I think that we're starting to see what this is going to look like on a very small scale. I think Bitcoiners can take El Salvador and we can make grand plans about the future of the world. We need to, temper that and understand that El Salvador is very, very small. And so it's like a test. It's like a laboratory experiment. It's not proof of what's going to happen in the future, but I think that it is a case study. Certainly, I think that's the case.
And what do you think are going to bring more people into Bitcoin?
That's a good question. It really depends. I think what countries do. There's a few paths forward, right? And so there's countries will have an impact on a Bitcoin adoption, but Bitcoiners will have an impact, and I'll break kind of those down real quick. So countries, like I said, if they roll out with tyrannical CBDCs, that's the best marketing pitch ever for Bitcoin. And so you kind of get them forcing people into Bitcoin. That's on a negative note, but Bitcoin wins. On a positive note, and you'll get a common thread here, is I believe in all scenarios, Bitcoin wins, just because it's a better system and it's anti-fragile. It actually becomes stronger the more it's opposed. But in a positive scenario, you have somebody like Trump, who is in pretty much every poll right now is favored to win in the U.S. election. And whether you think he's a good or bad politician, I think, I'm just cards on the table. I'm actually going to vote for Trump in 2 weeks. I don't trust him as far as I can throw him. He's a politician, right? Like, I believe that out of this election, that's the best choice. But I don't think we should have inherent trust in our politicians. But if he does stay true to his commitment to have a Bitcoin treasury in the United States, you're seeing massive Bitcoin adoption. What does that do to the markets when people understand that the U.S. government is now officially holding 210,000 Bitcoin? They've been doing it quietly. I think most Americans don't know that the U.S. is one of the largest holders of Bitcoin in the world, but Trump will be out there bragging about this. And I think the incentives will be that he will actually have the U.S. Treasury buy more Bitcoin. What does that do to the market when the most powerful treasury reserve in the world is adding Bitcoin to its stack? So in a very positive way, Bitcoin wins, and that's a lot of positive market sentiment, and people will start to buy it and hold it. When more companies, because of the strategies that MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor are laying out, more companies hold it on their balance sheets as well. It's going to be easier as a publicly traded company to go to your board of directors and say, hey, the US government is now officially holding Bitcoin and they're bragging about it. We need to hold Bitcoin as well. because look at the US is doing it, but MicroStrategy, that crazy guy over there, his strategy is making his stock go bananas. We need to adopt that too. So that snowball is going to happen. Once companies hold Bitcoin on their balance sheets, you're only a stone's throw away from those publicly traded companies being able to accept Bitcoin as payment. You need to have something as a store of value in kind of the economic order. You need to have something as a store of value before you can use it as a medium of exchange. But if everybody has it in their savings, it's very easy to accept it as a medium of exchange. And once every business is now touching Bitcoin, we're not getting all sorts of sell orders. Right now, if you say, there's plenty of websites where you can go and use Bitcoin to check out for your purchase, but then that company just turns around and sells Bitcoin. So every time you spend your Bitcoin on those sites, it's suppressing the price of Bitcoin in a very small way, right? You're placing a sell order on the market. But what happens when all that Bitcoin is being used actually in commerce? Because that, like my company, we actually do accept Bitcoin, but we get such a small amount that we just keep it in our treasury. We don't ever turn around and use that as part of our cash flow. But when we can use it as part of our cash flow and say the people that we buy our supplies from, like our paper towels and our cleaning products and things like that, when I can turn around and not have to liquidate my Bitcoin in order to buy that, I can now keep more of my company's cash in Bitcoin because I can turn around and use it as a medium of exchange. So each one of these steps makes Bitcoin adoption happen on a commerce level. And when Bitcoin happens on a commerce level, it's the cat's out of the bag. I mean, there's no putting that toothpaste back in the tube at that point, because you've now unleashed a far more efficient form of money that it wins in terms of efficiency, but now everybody wants to hold it because it's the only form of money that is actually appreciating over time, or at least maintaining your buying power. So it's literally, if there was a checklist of Bitcoin versus USD, it's going to win on every single category, and it's going to become, that dichotomy is going to be played out front and center in front of every person in society, and it's a no-brainer at that point.
And we also need it not to be a taxable event, right?
And that's right. That's a massive part of that. And I jumped over that. Absolutely. That's a great point. But I believe that Trump probably would make that, he would advocate for legislation around that. And I think there's enough Republicans who are pro Bitcoin who are going to be in this next Congress and this next Senate that will, I think that will pass with flying colors. I actually think that would be very, and even honestly, if Kamala Harris gets in, I think there's enough crypto lobbyists in general that are advocating for that we might get it under either administration. It might be a little bit more quiet under a Kamala administration, but under a Trump one, I actually think he's going to brag about that because I do think that he thinks that, one, he likes to brag. Two, he sees that as a pathway to American prosperity.
Yeah, that will be really exciting, because then as a medium of exchange, then it is a medium of exchange because it's not a taxable event, and we have,
right.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about, right, salt and light wellness. And before we get there, also, you're a black belt in jiu-jitsu, right? Wow.
I am.
So tell me how all this came together.
Well, with regard to the black belt in jiu-jitsu, growing up, as a kid, I always thought martial arts were really cool. I asked my parents to get me into karate. They took me to karate like twice, and then they said it was too expensive, and they didn't think it was worth my while because I was in other sports, and so they thought baseball was more important. So I never really got to do martial arts when I was a kid, but loved martial arts movies and that sort of thing. Kind of trained a little bit as a younger adult, kickboxing, boxing, those types of things. When my daughter was born, so this is like 2013. It's about the time I was getting into Bitcoin. I started getting into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu pretty heavily. I trained a little bit before that, but at that point I thought, you know what? I heard it takes something like 10 years to get your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. And I want to make sure, and if it takes longer than that, I want to make sure that when my daughter's of dating age, that I'm a black belt by that point. That was just like in my head. I never told anybody that at the time. I say it now because in hindsight, it's kind of funny. But I do. My daughter's going to turn 11 soon, so she's not quite the dating age, but I got my black belt a couple years ago, so we're ahead of schedule. I ended up having 2 more daughters, so I have 3 daughters and a son, and so I've got plenty of guys that I definitely am going to want to intimidate in the future. So I think having a black belt helps with that. But as far as your question about Salt and Light Wellness, this is something that I've been doing since I got out of college. My wife and I started it in 2008. So we've been doing it for 16 years now. We've grown into a small regional chain in Southern California. We just started franchising recently. We sold our first franchise like a couple months ago. And so our business is growing. And honestly, I'll tell you what, because there's been ups and downs. Health and wellness, or wellness, kind of holistic wellness services like what we do here, are kind of in vogue now, but there was a long time when it wasn't in vogue. And I think, part of why I say CBDCs are going to be one of the biggest things ever for Bitcoin adoption, it's because I have experience with COVID-19 being one of the biggest prompts for people to accept holistic wellness, right? You wouldn't think that the tyranny of COVID-19 would be this great beacon for health and wellness. There was plenty of people that became far less healthy because of the habits that they developed during COVID-19. But there are a lot of people, I would say perhaps even more people, that developed a better understanding of health and wellness through that time. They started asking questions. And so anyways, that's what I was going to say before that, though, was in the ups and downs of our business, when our business was having a really hard time, having Bitcoin as a treasury asset was probably one of the biggest things for the survival of our company in difficult times. Even though we weren't facing like major inflation at the time, Bitcoin appreciating as an asset was always making our business grow in value because we were holding it in our treasury. And so as long as we were able to squeak by on cash flow, our business was always improving because we just held a better asset. And so it's kind of like that MicroStrategy thing. It got them. MicroStrategy was just a par company or a below par company. They weren't an exceptional company before they were a Bitcoin company. But as they grew and their Bitcoin treasury grew, their company grew in value, and that enabled them to reinvest in capital that made their company better. And so now they're actually a pretty exceptional company who also runs on a Bitcoin standard. And I think that that's what's happened to our company, is that we were a so-so company. We were trying to figure our way out, but our company, even with us kind of not being truly exceptional, our company kept improving because we held assets that were exceptional assets. And that's enabled us to, again, reinvest in ourselves and make ourselves a bit better. I don't think I'm an exceptional businessman, but I think I've been able to surround myself with people who are pretty exceptional. And that's causing our business to thrive. But if anybody's in Southern California and you want to come to Salt and Light Wellness, we do cold plunges and red light therapy and infrared saunas and sunbeds. And I don't know if I said salt rooms, but yeah, we do all sorts of holistic wellness treatments. You come in, you spend, 5 minutes here, you can spend an hour here. You walk out feeling 1,000 times better than when you walked in. We're about robust health. And so we're really passionate about that. And like I said, these things I never saw Bitcoin and what we did in health and wellness as the same thing until like down the road. I just thought they were two things that I was into. We do health and wellness, and then I was also kind of like buying and holding Bitcoin kind of as an investment. But you start to realize that a lot of your favorite Bitcoiners are showing up on your favorite health and wellness podcasts because those two worlds talk to one another. Centralized health is one of the most damaging things for health of the Western world, right? The individual is far less healthy because of centralized food, because of centralized pharma, in the same way that because of centralized money, people are far more poor. And so, like I said, going back to what we were talking about with parallel, it's a battle of centralization between centralization and decentralization. And decentralization is inherently disorganized unless we fight and we advocate to make it as organized as possible.
Yeah, well, I'll be one of the first to visit your wellness centers. I studied holistic health for 30 years, and I've always known that the healthcare system is really the sick care system because
Yeah.
it's incentivized to make money, not to make people well. But yeah, I never put Bitcoin and health together. But I hear so many people saying they got into Bitcoin and they want to get healthier because they
Yep.
have more hope. So,
Yeah.
how has Bitcoin changed you?
I'm inherently a short-term thinker. I think I grew up as somebody who was just very spontaneous, and I think some of my early successes as an adult came from doing things spontaneous, not, at 22 years old, not being afraid to jump into a business and fail. And so there is a bit of spontaneity and fearlessness that I think does help people. But I continued to do that because I thought, oh, that made me successful in one thing. So I just always kind of it was like shoot, ready, aim. I was like doing things in the wrong order. And so I realized like I had early successes, but then I was having kind of failures and rough times and hard learning curves with growing and developing the business beyond that and in other areas of my life. And so once I came across Bitcoin, it started turning into this long-term play. Once you go through a bear and bull market cycle, you start to realize that, yeah, this isn't about shooting to the moon, even in the next 4 years. This is about, it's kind of like winning the lottery, but winning the lottery in slow motion. And when you do that, it takes a high degree of patience, because if if the Bitcoin you hold today is going to be insanely valuable in three halvings from now, that means that there's two halvings where the value of your money is going to go up tremendously, and the ability to cash out and to use it on whatever purchases that would make you have fun and enjoy life a little bit, that temptation is going to be really high. So you're not just having to be patient through the low times. We always think about having to be patient through the bear markets of like, oh, Bitcoin's price is down. It's kind of easy once you've learned the basics to not sell in the bottom of the bull market unless you just have to for some kind of emergency. But it's far more difficult to go through a bull cycle and to see the value of your money go up, and then you go through another bear cycle and wow, then it went back down, and then you go through another bull cycle and you've been vindicated, and all the years that you spent in the bear cycle were down, and now it's finally like, you know what, I deserve this, I should cash out. But it forces you to think even further out. And so that's been incredibly edifying for me, and it's been a huge asset in terms of helping me grow, in terms of thinking kind of more generationally. I mean, you hear the old adage, in terms of how poor people think month to month, middle class people think year to year, millionaires think decade to decade, and then billionaires think in terms of generations, right? And just the further out you can zoom on your perspective, it enables you to play at a higher level. I'm certainly not a billionaire, but I'm definitely trying to think like somebody that can zoom out like that. And I think that Bitcoiners, we tend to do that. And that's part of why the social layer is so important, is so important, because we have a proclivity to think short term. But when we get around other people who are talking about long-term thinking, it entices us to think like that. And so, yeah, if you haven't been to a Bitcoin meetup, or you haven't gone to a conference, or you haven't hung out with another Bitcoiner in real life, it's probably one of the best things you can do for your Bitcoin journey. And so that it's changed me in ways that I'm glad I learned. And I think it's continuing to change people. I think we're seeing more Bitcoiners come online every day because of that.
Yeah, so patience, patience. That's a good one. Well, you seem like one of the most industrious people to me, Brian. And tell us where people can find you.
Well, I'm most responsive on Orange Pill app. So if you do become a member of Orange Pill app, just DM me on there. If you're in Southern California, like, I'm always down for a meetup. You can find me on that. I'm on X as well, so at Brian Dement. I do have a YouTube channel as well. The focus of my YouTube channel, you just search my name. It's called Freshly Minted with Brian Dement. So if you just search in Brian Dement, it'll pop up. I put a lot of shorts out there, and it's really meant to be orange pill content. We didn't talk about my first book today, and that's I really enjoy talking about parallel, because that's, I think, the big idea, especially for any new Bitcoiners, or if you're a Bitcoiner that you're in the phase of trying to orange pill friends and family, this is kind of that phase of the bull market where you're going to get a lot more questions. Bitcoin evangelism is a really good resource for Bitcoiners to be able to describe Bitcoin in a way that's easy for people to understand. So if you have a hard time orange pilling your friends and family, read Bitcoin evangelism. Read Bitcoin evangelism. If you don't want to read a book, if that's not your style, then my YouTube channel kind of helps supplement that. It's a lot of shorts about how do I explain why the code can't be changed, or how do I explain digital 21 million, why that matters. So I try to put as much content into 1 minute that you can either watch yourself or you can just send it to somebody of like, hey, we were talking, my aunt asked me why they can't just change the code. Well, here, Brian has this really good short that's 60 seconds, and let me help you with your understanding. So a lot of what my content is about equipping Bitcoiners to win this intellectual battle.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. I ask most of my guests how they orange pill family members and friends, and I'm honestly not great at it. So I'm going to read Bitcoin Evangelism.
I
Thank you so
appreciate that.
much, Brian. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Paula. Anytime. It was a fun time talking to you, especially offline where you actually got to talk a little bit more. You're so polite about teeing me up for the questions. I think the audience would love to hear you talk. Probably me turn around and ask you questions. So next time I'm gonna have to ask you a few.
Thank you.